So welcome to this video. In this video I'm going to be looking at how to code the backend for Dolphin flashcards, and I'll be looking at their very kind of low level details, and there's also a high level video that goes along with this which is linked in the description, and in that video I talk about kind of the high level view of how to code the backend, and so if you're wanting more details then you should watch this video. So what we will look at is we will look in more detail about how API routes work, and then we'll talk about how to use Insomnia, which is one program that you can use to send API requests. And so then looking at API routes, so all the backend code is in the root/API folder in the backend folder, or rather all the code for the API routes is in root/API, and all the backend code is in the backend folder. So if we look at root/API, you can see the full files here that have the API routes in, the ones indicated by the arrows. And if we just look at one example API route, so here's the code for one API route. And first of all, you can see on line 146, it says, card management underscore routes dot root API/create folder. And so what that means is you can see the text at the bottom. It says localhost 5000/API/create folder. So localhost 5000 is the computer we're using, so the server and the port, where localhost is the server name, the name of our computer, and 5000 is the port we're running it on. And then /API/create folder is a route that you can see on line 146. So then to make a request, you go to this URL and then you pass it the information shown on the lines 152 and 153, so that kind of JSON information in the comments. And so to send a request, you just go to that URL and then you pass it that JSON information, you pass it the username and the folder, and then it'll return a result to you. And then on line 147, you can see it says validate JSON create folder format. Create folder format is stored, you can see on the right hand here, where it says create folder format. And so that defines the information that you're allowed to pass the server. And you can see you can pass it the JWT token and the folder. And so validate JSON on line 147 is a function that makes sure that when you send a request, it follows the format shown by create folder format and line 36. And so then line 147 is validation that we use to make sure that the request is correct. And then whenever a JWT token is passed in a request, it's turned to the user ID. So what I mean by that is you can see on line 36, it says JWT token, but on line 152, it says user ID. The reason for that is because when you send a request, you send it the JWT token, and then it turns that into the user ID. So it looks at the JWT token, and then it gets the user ID from that. There is a quick exception, which is when you're running the database in the local mode. So when you're running a local database, then you pass it the user ID instead of the JWT token. But that's just something you can get to when you start actually kind of coding. And then you can get API documentation from the site you can see here, and a link is in the description. And then now let's look at how to run API calls, and for this we'll be using Insomnia. So there's a couple of different programs you can use, and for example you can use Postman, but I tend to use Insomnia. And so looking at Insomnia, a link to download it is in the video description. So when we load it, then you can see kind of a dashboard of what things you can use and of what you have available. And so here, for example, you can click a collection that I've already made, which is called Dolphin Test. And a collection is basically a collection of API routes that you save, and then you can use it again. So here, I've created a collection called Dolphin Test. And then here, I've got some example API calls set up. And if we look more about what all this is showing, then first of all on the left hand pane there you can see the API calls you've used before. So you save an API call, so you save things like the URL, the JSON data you send with it, the methods for the API call, you save all that information and then you can use it later. And that means it's faster because whenever you make a new request you don't need to enter the details again. And then here you can see the body button. This allows you to enter JSON data, but more on that later. And then here you can see the response error code. So 404, for example, means the page wasn't found. If it says 200, then it means the response succeeded. And then here you can see the actual message of the response. And so how do we make a new API request then? Well, let's go through this. So first of all, you press the plus icon you can see there, and then you press HTTP request, and then you'll see this page. And so it's created a new request. And first of all, then we will look at how to set up this API call for this route. So the one you can see here, and we've looked at that a second ago. So the /API/create folder route. So the first step is to give the request a name, and you can call it anything. And so here you can see I've named it create folder. And next we set the request method. So that's the type of request it is. And you can see from this line here that our API route is a post method. And so here we click where it says get, and we open the drop down and we click post. And then you can see that the request method has been updated. Now the next step is to enter the URL. So if we switch back to our code in a second, then we're going to see more information about this. So here I've put localhost 5000/API/create folder. Now let's look at this in more detail. And so first of all, let's look at where it says HTTP. So HTTP is just a standard thing you add at the start. It means no encryption is being used, which is normal. HTTPS means encryption is being used. The S stands for secure. The next part is localhost, which means my computer. You could change that to your computer IP address instead. So for example, you could change it to this IP address, but then that would mean you'd have to actually find out your IP address, which is slightly annoying. Not that annoying, but you know. And then you've now got the port. You need to enter the port your server is running on. And so in main.py, backend/main.py, it defines the port the server is running on, and for Dolphin flashcards, it's running on port 5000. And so then next we've got the API create folder part. And so now you get that from the code for the API route. So for example, you can see on line 146, it says the route is at /API/create folder. And so that's where our part then, the URL we've passed to Insomnia comes in. And so when you're making a new request to a different route, this part, so /API/create folder, is the only thing that's going to need to change. And so then once we've set the URL, then we next need to send the JSON, set the JSON we want to send with the request. So we click body, and then we expand the drop down here, and we click JSON. And so next we need to actually work out what JSON data to send with the request. And so what we do is we go to the code for the API route, and we copy and paste the part selected by the box. And either one of them works, but you can see here that on line 152 we define user ID, but on line 36 we define JWT token. And there's the obvious question, which one do we need to pass? And the answer is that if you're using the local database, so in your database configuration file, which I talk about in the first video, in the high-level overview video, if in the database configuration file you set type equals local, then when you make your API request, you need to pass the user ID and you don't pass the JWT token. But if your database is the Firebase database, if you're using the production database in your database configuration file, then you need to pass the JWT token and you can't pass it the user ID. The reason for that slight complexity, is because that means when you're running a local database, you don't have to worry as much about things like authentication, which makes it a lot easier and a lot simpler to write code. So then you can also get the user ID by using the create account route. So in the previous slide, you may have the question, how do I get the user ID? How do I know what my user's user ID is? And the answer is, well, you can create a user ID, you can create a new ID, and to do that you use this API route. And again, you can see more information about that API route in the documentation. And so here, for example, I've created a new folder using my user ID, which I previously created with the create account route. So first of all, I went to create account and I made my own account with a username of Jacob. And then here I entered this JSON information that I saw from the code. And then I pressed the send button to send the API request, which you can see next to the URL. And then it gave me a response. And so this is kind of how you send API requests. And so then in a summary, we've looked at API routes in more detail, and we've looked at how to use Insomnia. And so next you can kind of start working on backend issues.